Welcome to the deep dive. You send us sources, we pull out the key insights, and basically get you up to speed fast.
Yeah, it's about getting that deep understanding without, wading through everything yourself.
Exactly. So today we've got a pretty pointed article. It's Larken Rose's Dave Smith Relapses into Statism.
Right. And Dave Smith, for you who might follow libertarian circles, is a comedian, a commentator.
And this article, well, it's a critique, a strong one, focused on Smith's recent comments about immigration and border control.
It's definitely not pulling any punches. Rose goes right at what he sees as the core issues.
So our mission here is to unpack Rose's arguments for you. What's he actually saying? What's his fundamental philosophical clash he's outlining?
Yeah, we're looking at that tension between individual liberty, as Rose sees it, and the idea of state-enforced borders.
We're hoping to get you those aha moments. Rose uses some, let's say, provocative language and arguments, philosophical critiques, analogies, really pointed questions.
Definitely. It's designed to make you think. And it's important to start with Rose's view of statism itself. It's not just politics for him.
Okay, yeah, let's jump right there. Rose doesn't just disagree with the policy. He calls statism itself a mental and moral failure.
He does. His phrase is that it rots the soul and mind. Pretty strong stuff.
Intense. So what's behind that? Why such a harsh judgment?
Well, for Rose, the core issue is that he believes statism allows people to justify actions like violence or coercion, things they'd normally see as wrong, just because the state is doing it.
Ah, okay, so it kind of short-circuits personal morality?
That's his argument, that it corrupts individual moral reasoning. He sees it as the root problem.
And he argues this isn't something people reason their way into, right? He compares it to indoctrination.
Exactly. He suggests it's more like a deeply ingrained belief system, almost like a religion, rather than a logical conclusion people reach.
He even uses an analogy, doesn't he? Something about a disease.
Yeah, the disease of the mind analogy. He's not saying it's a literal illness, but he uses to convey how he thinks it blocks clear thinking and moral consistency.
And leads people to become, what was his phrase?
His words were unthinking, unprincipled, immoral, hypocritical cowards. Like I said, he doesn't hold back.
Okay. So with that very critical view of statism as our background, let's look at this specific disagreement with Dave Smith over mass deportations. How does Rose frame that?
Rose frames mass deportations very starkly. He boils it down to the state using force to remove people from a place against their will.
He strips away the legal talk.
Completely. He focuses on the raw act, removing peaceful individuals by force simply because they lack what he calls the written permission of the ruling class.
Peaceful being the key word there. He's focused on people who haven't actually aggressed against anyone.
Correct. In his view, their only crime is being somewhere without the state's okay. He sees that as fundamentally arbitrary and, well, cruel from a libertarian standpoint that values non-aggression.
It seems like a direct contradiction to that non-aggression principle he mentions later.
That's exactly his point. If you believe in not initiating force, how do you justify the state forcibly removing someone who hasn't initiated force?
Now, Rose also takes issue with the very common phrase, our country. That sounds like a really fundamental challenge.
It is. It stems from his radical individualism. He calls our country a collectivist delusion.
A delusion. Wow. So what's real then, in his view?
Individual property ownership. He argues only the actual owner of a piece of land has the moral right to say who can or cannot be on it, not the government, not some collective.
So national borders for Rose don't have the same moral weight as, say, the fence around my backyard.
Pretty much. He sees them as artificial lines drawn by the state, which don't override individual property rights. It flips the usual perspective completely.
So the government, according to Rose, just doesn't have the moral standing to say you can't come in or you have to leave based on these lines on a map.
That's his position. Because where does that authority come from? This ties into his other core belief, that the government can't legitimately own anything.
Right, because its resources are taken coercively through taxes and whatnot.
Yes. That's his foundational argument. Since government funds and resources ultimately come from coercion, any claim it makes to own land or control territory is, in his view, illegitimate.
So if the government enforces borders, overriding what a private property owner might want, like inviting a guest from abroad, Rose sees that as
the government essentially acting like it owns everything, it implies a level of state control that negates private property rights at a fundamental level.
Okay, I can really see the philosophical clash now. Smith, presumably a believer in property rights,
Right.
seems to support state border enforcement, which Rose argues directly undermines those very rights.
That's the inconsistency Rose is hammering home. He uses that example. You invite a guest from Mexico, say. The state kicks them out based on laws Smith seems to support. Rose asks, isn't Smith then complicit in violating your property rights?
It's a powerful framing.
It is. And Rose then anticipates and counters the common arguments people use to defend border controls.
Like the you lock your doors analogy, how does he deal with that one?
His rebuttal is pretty direct. He says, yeah, you own your house, you lock your door, but you don't own the whole country.
So the analogy doesn't scale.
Exactly. He argues it's a faulty comparison. Applying individual home ownership logic to an entire nation doesn't work unless you're willing to say Congress literally owns all of America.
Okay. And the other big one. It's illegal to cross without permission. How does Rose handle the legality argument?
He makes a very sharp distinction between what's legal and what's moral. For Rose, just because the state makes a law doesn't make obeying it moral or disobeying it immoral.
So crossing a border without state permission isn't inherently immoral in his view?
Not unless that person is violating someone's actual rights, like trespassing on private property they weren't invited onto or committing theft or violence. He accuses Smith of confusing disobedience to the state with actual wrongdoing.
Then there's that very vivid hypothetical he poses, asking Smith to imagine himself at the border.
Yeah, standing there with a rifle facing a woman and child trying to cross. It's deliberately provocative.
It's the point of that, to shock.
Partly, maybe, but the main goal is to force a confrontation with the reality of the violence involved. Rose is asking, if you, personally, wouldn't point a gun at this peaceful person, why is it okay to pay the state through taxes to do it for you?
It really drills down into the morality of delegating force.
Exactly. It challenges that disconnect between supporting a policy and taking personal responsibility for the actions required to enforce it.
And he sort of reminds Smith of basic libertarian principles, right? Like a checklist.
He does. He lists things like no victim, no crime, meaning if no one's rights were violated, it's not a real crime. The non-aggression principle, or NAC, don't initiate force.
Right.
Legality and morality, which we just discussed. And the big one, government owns nothing.
He's essentially saying Smith's stance on borders violates all of these.
That's the core of his accusation.
Yeah.
That Smith has strayed from these fundamental principles.
And the tone throughout this article, it's not exactly gentle persuasion.
Oh, definitely not. It's blunt. It's mocking at times.
Hmm.
Relentless. He uses sarcasm, strong language, analogies meant to be jarring. It's very personal, wrapped up in the philosophy.
So what's the final verdict from Rose on Dave Smith?
His conclusion is pretty damning. He basically accuses Smith of abandoning core libertarian ideals, maybe out of fear, maybe for other reasons Rose doesn't specify. He paints him as morally compromised, hypocritical.
Because he criticizes the state elsewhere but supports it here.
Yes. For Rose, it's an irreconcilable contradiction. You can't be a true libertarian, in his definition, and support state border enforcement. That's the central conflict he presents.
Okay. So that brings us through this deep dive into Larken Rose's critique. It really highlights this fundamental disagreement about the state's role, individual rights, and what borders even mean, morally speaking.
It really does. And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it? When you get right down to it, what is the ultimate ethical basis for any kind of collective control or authority, especially over movement?
Yeah. Where do individual rights stop and group or national interests or perceived interests begin? How do we square these abstract philosophies like libertarianism with the really complex, messy realities of, migration, security, different people wanting different things?
Rose presents one very clear, very uncompromising answer. But thinking about the underlying assumptions about liberty, about society, about who gets to decide, well, that's something that goes way beyond just this one article. It definitely gives you a lot to think about.